Thank you all for joining us. My name is Bruce Jones. I'm the Vice President and the Director of the Foreign Policy Program here at Brookings. And thank you for joining us today for what I'm sure will be an illuminating discussion of one of America's greatest foreign policy challenges. We titled our event provocatively, asking if we're witnessing the end of U.S. engagement with China. But our goal is to move beyond a binary assessment and have a nuanced discussion tackling some of the fundamental questions about the future of this bilateral relationship. We begin with a keynote address by the Honorable Representative Rick Larsen, and then we'll convene two panels of experts. The first will define the challenges posed by China's actions and behavior inside the United States, and the second will discuss how to respond to those challenges by examining engagement policy that has guided relations with China through 8 consecutive administrations. And after each panel, we'll have time for audience questions and discussion. I think it's fair to say that in recent years, frustration has mounted in the United States as the notion of China's, quote, peaceful rise has increasingly morphed to a more bold and assertive China, certainly inside Asia and increasingly globally. Alongside fairly benign projects like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Belt and Road Initiative, China has worked tenaciously to reclaim islands in the South China Sea, asserted itself in the East China Sea, and is increasingly stirring controversy through its use of what has been termed sharp power to influence public discourse in Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and elsewhere. And just last week, China announced plans to amend its constitution, remove presidential term limits, a move that inflamed a sense that U.S. engagement with China has not produced the kinds of change in direction that some had hoped. Partly against this backdrop, the Trump administration's first national security strategy, released in December, labeled China a, quote, strategic competitor and questioned the value of engagement policy. More recently, FBI Director Christopher Wray used congressional testimony to characterize China as not just a whole-of-government threat, but a whole-of-society threat, requiring a whole-of-society response by the United States. So this is a fairly dramatic escalation in the depiction of the relationship. It seems to me that the existing challenge of China needs to be taken seriously, and we have to start with a robust and a clear-eyed assessment of its behavior and of our behavior. But the issues as a whole call for a thoughtful and a balanced assessment that articulates the boundary between genuine concern on the one hand and paranoia on the other, and proposes productive responses. We're honored today to have Congressman Rick Larsen to deliver today's keynote address. He's represented Washington's 2nd District since 2001. Among his many roles, and most relevant to today's discussion, he is also co-chairman of the Congressional U.S. China Working Group. He's a friend to Brookings, and he's collaborated with us over many years. In 2005, he was a stand-in for Henry Kissinger at a Brookings event prior to the Obama-Xi summit, and he asked us this time if he was a stand-in for Henry. He said, no, you're our first choice. So please join me in welcoming Congressman Larsen to the stage, and then we'll follow on with a discussion.
Thanks, Bruce. And thanks for the opportunity to be here at Brookings, and good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here. I want to thank Brookings for the invitation to be a keynote today. I appreciate that opportunity. But I did note to Bruce as I walked in, I said, I think you got your title wrong, which the title is this the end of U.S. engagement with China? I think a more appropriate title would be, is this the end of U.S. engagement with China, the EU, Canada, Mexico, and so on? Well, the short answer to that, I think, is no, obviously, but just focusing on the title of this morning, I can understand anxiety that folks have. For instance, last year, China again have made commitments to improve market access and reduce restrictions on foreign investments, the latest in several commitments over the last 20 years, and yet there seems to be little to no movement on those commitments. China continues its efforts to be a development and growth model, challenging existing international rules and an international order that existed for 70 years, and one from which it benefited, and one that the U.S. has largely led, and now, again, seems to be challenging that order. And China, as Bruce mentioned, China's continued efforts to create and militarize artificial islands in the South China Sea and its unwillingness to comply with international norms there can seem to indicate that China is not interested in finding mutual beneficial solutions either. So the question of today's forum should not be a surprise to anyone. And as well, what good is continuing to engage on these issues if the U.S. gets so little in return? It seems a fair question, and honestly, a question on Capitol Hill is asked quite often. And some of my colleagues in Congress have called for a more hawkish approach and attitude towards China to prepare for the inevitable conflict with China, in their words. But other writers have taken a more nuanced approach. In a most recent issue of Foreign Affairs, Eli Ratner and Kurt Campbell note that throughout history, the U.S. has regularly set too high a bar in its expectations of shaping China's trajectory. They said, and this is a quote, reality warrants a clear-eyed thinking of the U.S. approach to China. Building a stronger, more sustainable approach to and relationship with Beijing requires honesty about how many fundamental assumptions have turned out wrong, end quote. So again, I ask, does the U.S. response to these actions that China is taking need to be more hawkish, as some of my colleagues want, or more realistic, and as we might hear today? And I certainly fall on the more realistic side of things. But I want to address maybe how we go about doing that and use an American football analogy. For those who follow American football, you'll get it. And for those who don't, ask your neighbor. So in other words, to look at this analogy, does the U.S. need to act more like a defensive coordinator, or do we need to think like a head coach and develop new offensive and defensive strategies, a new playbook, or even dust off the old playbook that are better tailored to the outcome that we want to see? I certainly, again, fall on the latter side. We're playing a lot of defense right now in our approach, instead of thinking about what offensive tools that we already have and what tools that we can develop to play offense. And not necessarily offense against China, but just offense for its own sake, to put the U.S., keep the U.S. Out in the world. And I want to cover some of what that means. It's time to, again, strengthen these tools. So instead of looking at the Belt Road Initiative, as some people do, as something to be afraid of, the U.S. can use tools like the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, the Export-Import Bank, the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, to better offer more options to emerging markets and emerging democracies in development finance and democratic governance than just the options that they might be getting through BRI. We have to have a strategic offensive plan that takes into account issues like education, business, foreign trade and investment, our military capabilities as well, and a bilateral relationship with China. So I just want to say that these ideas aren't necessarily mine or new. There are a lot of good folks here and a lot of good folks at one of your competitors at CSIS and good folks at other places who've said some of the same things. But I don't know that on Capitol Hill or frankly in the White House that they're we're really doing a good job of looking at this relationship holistically. That we are really slicing it up into parts and concluding that it's not going well. So what are those parts? Well, I think first the U.S. we should go more on offense when it comes to education. Foreign language skills have to be a critical part of our U.S. schools, and the U.S. foreign language lags and limits our ability to compete globally. So there's an estimated 300 million English language learners in China, and only 1.6 million Americans identify themselves as Chinese language speakers in the last census. Compare that total to the number of students in kindergarten through high school in the U.S. who study Spanish, which is necessary as well, but that's 7 million. Another 1.2 million students study French. The number of students studying Chinese in that age range is a little over 227,000. In 2015, President Obama and President Xi Jinping committed to expand the number of U.S. K-12 students studying Mandarin to 1 million by 2020, and we have to continue to build on that commitment. Congress can increase funding for programs such as foreign language and area studies fellowships and the Bourne scholarships that assist college students studying foreign languages and international studies. Beyond investments in foreign language, the U.S. must be better equipped to compete with China and with other countries in emerging scientific fields like artificial intelligence, robotics, quantum computing, and nanotechnology. This is a speech that I give to my mechanical engineering son almost every day. But to do this, the U.S. has to educate and train a workforce with skills necessary to succeed in an ever-changing global economy. So, our foreign policy success is going to depend a little bit on domestic policy successes. Our education system needs to encourage more students to pursue an interest in science, technology, and engineering and math. By 2022 in the U.S. there will be about 9 million STEM-related jobs in the United States, yet we can't attract enough students for those positions. Only 40% of the U.S. students who enter college intending to major in a STEM field actually graduate with a degree in STEM. So we don't need 100% of students, of all students studying STEM, but we'd like to have close to 100% of the students who start studying STEM to finish studying STEM. We need to continue to push legislation that creates access to apprenticeships that my generation benefited from, and advocate for the funding of career and technical education to help states close that skills gap and prepare students for the transition from high school to community college to an apprenticeship or job training. I know most of you thought you came here to hear a foreign policy speech, but we got to do both. An area where we have been on offense, but perhaps need a little bit different playbook, is ensuring our businesses can compete on a level playing field globally. Now, some in Congress want to do this by reforming the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States process and include more aggressive export controls. Rather than stifling the business climate by establishing a stricter CFIUS process, the U.S. should pair measured reform with policy changes that incentivize China to open its economy. We need a more comprehensive analysis of the net impact of foreign direct investment in the United States so we actually know what we're dealing with if we start tinkering around with CFIUS. And we should have this report before moving forward with any changes. Businesses are getting increasingly frustrated with Chinese business policy. The American Chamber of Commerce 2017 annual report concluded that while businesses are generally upbeat on relations, 75% of members feel foreign companies are less welcome in China than they have been in the past. We can do many things to address these concerns, but I think one thing, again, this is dusting off the playbook, the Office of the U.S. Trade Rep must continue and reinvigorate negotiations on a bilateral investment treaty with China. Now, as co-chair of a New Dems, it's a caucus within the Congress, the New Dems Trade Task Force, I would be remiss if I did not say that our new offensive playbook must include foreign investments and trade. China's Belt and Road Initiative has spooked some analysts and some of my colleagues in Congress, as I mentioned, as a threat to U.S. status in Asia. But rather than responding with alarmism, the U.S. should reinvest in existing programs that promote trade, investment, and economic diplomacy. Again, we can go on offense. We don't need to cower in fear before the Belt and Road Initiative, which is basically just, it's a lot of construction. It's probably more than that, I understand. But trade's an important soft power tool for the U.S. to use. And we need to continue to develop strong agreements with our partners in the Asia Pacific. And I would even include getting back into TPP. That shouldn't be news to anyone here who knows me. But additionally, the U.S. can and should play a leadership role in organizations that create opportunities for U.S. businesses in Asia and for businesses in countries in Asia, such as the World Bank, such as the Asian Development Bank. We should also continue prioritizing within the State Department, APEC, as well as the Department's Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs. And so while a focus on Asia is important, again, we can't fail to recognize the importance of investment in other areas of the world, including Africa. And this week, Secretary Tillerson delivered a speech talking about the importance of the African Growth and Opportunity Act. That's true, but we must do more. The U.S. does not need to compete dollar for dollar with Chinese investments in Africa, but we can maintain a continued presence in the countries of Africa. An increase in funds for Department of Commerce programs like Power Africa and Trade Africa, which help U.S. businesses operate in Africa and bring investment into countries in sub-Saharan Africa, demonstrate a U.S. commitment to the region in a time where China itself is funding more projects. I just want to move to the last couple of issues. First on security, and similar to an education strategy where we invest, the Department of Defense should expand research and partnerships into disruptive technologies that could upset a balance of power. This includes investments in critical technologies like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, nanotechnology, and supercomputing. And the budget should reflect that. The budget should reflect strengthening diplomatic relationships and military cooperation with our allies in the Asia-Pacific region. And these alliances and partnerships are an area of strategic advantage over China, who does not necessarily want to have partnerships and alliances. But when we maintain those and invest in these partnerships and alliances, it helps strengthen our friendships and should alleviate some of the concerns that my colleagues have. And I think the President should focus on strengthening ties with American friends rather than antagonizing our American friends. And our military should continue to pursue opportunities to engage with the PLA through multilateral exercises and policies to help avoid miscommunication during encounters. I'll just end on a note on the bilateral relationship as well. Because for all this said, I can tell you on Capitol Hill, we tend to think of competing with China all the time, when in fact there's a lot of room for cooperation still. On climate change, there's still room for cooperation, and I think we need to think long-term about that and not really stay focused just on the current president's policies and proposals with regard to climate change, but think long-term. On counterterrorism, there's room for cooperation. Certainly on North Korea, there's continued room for cooperation. We need to continue to pursue these areas of cooperation with China and have the strongest bilateral relationship that we can have. So the relationship is very complex. In fact, I've said we don't have one relationship with China. We have many relationships with China, depending on the issue. Some are high and some are low. I tend to think it's a little like the stock market. It goes up and down. It's a roller coaster, but it tends to inch up over time. And it can only grow as well through continued engagement, through continued dedication, and maybe a shot or two of Baijiu. But I tell you, it makes it difficult when, for me, to help in my way to manage a relationship when we have announcements from the White House that frankly aren't well thought through. And this latest announcement on steel and aluminum, which started out as something targeted at China, apparently applies to all countries who produce steel and aluminum, which includes many of our friends and allies. And people were more concerned about a trade war with China and didn't see a trade war with the EU coming. So we've got some, again, just some continued things that we have to manage here in the U.S. and take care of. But in the end, I just want to say that the main message I have is that we don't need to necessarily be on offense. We have on defense. We have an offensive playbook. We maybe need some new plays, but we have plays that have worked in the past, and we should use them not just in a way to compete with China, but in some ways to further cooperate with China, but also to ensure that the U.S. is even on the playing field with China and with many other countries. So with that, I'm going to end because I'm about to have a coughing fit. So appreciate the chance to be here, and I hope that's a good opening for you all, and I look forward to some questions from Chung Lee. Thank you.
Well, first I would like to join Bruce in expressing our profound appreciation to you and to all of the distinguished panelists for participating in today's event. Today's discussion is enormously important and timely because China is at the critical moment in its political trajectory, and the U.S. China relations are also at the crossroad. Congressman Larsen, many thanks for your very thoughtful and constructive remarks. You talk about Baijiu, I think probably better is Maotai. And I particularly struck by the way you emphasize our domestic challenges, how to improve our own country and also make us more competitive in a positive way in the international competition. This is certainly differ profoundly from some of the discussion we heard. I'm sure that your points have inspired many questions from the audience, but let me begin with first two questions. First, as you probably agree, although you did not mention, there are growing concern about China in the United States. These could be the result of what we perceive as China's assertive rise or sharp power influence. But this could also stem from China's domestic political situation, including the party's very tight media censorship, new measures to restrain NGOs and civil society, both Chinese and foreign, harsh treatment of human rights lawyers and human rights activists, and most recently, the abolishment of the term limits for the PRC presidency. Now, my first question is twofold. To what extent can these negative views in the United States be attributed to China's domestic move towards repression as opposed to worries about China's foreign policy or China's economic policy towards the United States? And two, are these domestic trends in China irreversible? And could China's increasingly pluralistic society and ever-growing middle class can be potentially forces in moving to the opposite direction?
Sure. So the first question that you ask about whether it's the negative views are based on Chinese foreign policy and its moves, or is it based on what's happening domestically in China? I think from my perspective on Capitol Hill, I'd say it's a combination of both. I'm on the Armed Services Committee. We're obviously watching the world closely and the U.S. role in the world, especially from a national security perspective. And there's the lack of action from China in complying or following international rules of order, especially when you look at the South China Sea and the use of international institutions to make a determination, the tribunal to make a determination about who owns what there, and then having China ignore it causes a lot of concern for folks on Capitol Hill because what would be next? What set of rules will be next to be ignored? And so from the foreign policy perspective, there's a good argument to say that that causes concern and that contributes to negative views. On the domestic side, I think what's happening in China sort of isn't and I understand the Chinese leadership may not care what my opinion is on this one, but I get to express it freely and walk out of here without being arrested, and that's my point. It's an affront to, I think, I hope most Americans' perception of what democracy is and what human rights is and what representation is when you see what is happening in China with, and you listed it, media censorship, lawyers being arrested, folks disappearing, and if whether President Xi wants another term or 2 terms or forever, I need to let some folks get me some back. I know he's going to want that, but I've asked some folks to help me understand what that is going to mean for U.S. policy. But again, it contributes to those negative views. So it's a combination of both. It's not one or the other. But also, I think, in conclusion, we need to consider from a policy perspective what we're going to spend our time on in order to try to shape, if you will, shape a response. We can do that more easily in the foreign policy realm. It's obviously a little tougher to shape Chinese domestic politics. But if we lack strong statements on democracy and human rights as part of our foreign policy, then we are doing our own selves a disservice. And I haven't seen this administration place democracy and human rights back to where it should be, alongside many other goals of foreign policy.
50-50, or which is more important?
Is this about math?
Okay, never mind.
I didn't know there'd be math on the test.
The other question, in the recent U.S. National Security Report, I think the President's State of Union address and the DOD's report have a similar point. They list 3 groups as the American strategic rivalries or even enemies. Start with a terrorist organization, then rogue states like North Korea and Iran, and revisionist countries such as China and the United States.
Russia.
I'm sorry, Russia. Because
Thanks a lot, Papa.
I'm instructed by the end of engagement, probably engage ourselves. Yeah. Well, is that strategically wise for the United States to have so many enemies at the same time? Should a more thoughtful distinction be made, for example, between Russia and China? Now, before having your answer, let me add my own comment. Competition aside, the Chinese economy is far more interdependent with the United States and Russia's. Also, currently, about 400,000 Chinese students attended American schools, including 35,000 at the secondary schools. Now, in comparison, Russia, a couple of years ago, is about 6,000. Now, of course, in my view, most of these Chinese students are not spies, I can assume. But young men and women make friends with their American peers. They are impressed by the American way of life, including media freedom, as you mentioned. So my point is that whether we, United States, should I think that's an important factor. And so your comment.
There's a lot to chew on there. On the first point with regard to the national security strategy, it is good to have one. It's better to use it. Sometimes we develop a national security strategy, that is, the administration does, and we don't really follow it, mainly because circumstances take over as opposed to trying to follow what you wrote on paper, because sometimes it all falls apart a week later. That's the first thing. The second thing regarding the 5 adversaries, or the 5 national security challenges we have, I wouldn't list it. I don't think the security strategy lists them as enemies, but certainly I'd say terrorists are. But the idea that we have 5 is fine. Just on that point, terrorism is a problem. North Korea is a problem. There are issues with Iran, and there are issues with Russia and China. My main criticism with regards to the Russia and China is that we tend to, on Capitol Hill, folks tend to lump them together like they're in some unholy bilateral alliance. I don't see that being the case. So being more discerning about the foreign policy and national security challenges with China is important first, and I think that's one thing I like to try to impress upon my colleagues on Capitol Hill, because lumping China and Russia together will end up with worse outcomes. like Russia, for instance, I think the Russian leadership has a much more tactical approach to the world, and as opposed to some broad, grand strategic vision of the world. China, on the other hand, I think does have a much broader strategic vision of the world and its place in the world, and that requires us to understand what that is, have an appropriate response, which again, as I laid out, it might include competition and it might include cooperation, but the main response you get on Capitol Hill is I call it the all about me department. That's in the all about me department. Everything that happens because it's happening to me, right? And that's how the U.S. sort of sees the world. If a country is doing something, they're only doing it because because it's about the United States. They're doing it because of the United States. And sometimes that's true. Most of the time it's not. And we look at China, like anything China does, they're doing that because they're doing it relative to the United States. Well, whether they are or they aren't, we ought to be putting forward continually what our vision of the world is, what our vision of our how we want our friends to see us, and be much more active as opposed to being responsive to whatever China does in the next given day. And this is for instance, the Chinese leadership through President Xi has been very clear about claiming, one, that they're the model of free markets and such, and that's going to be farther from the truth, frankly. And second, they're a new growth model for emerging markets in the developing world. And I think that, in part, they do want to be that, a new growth model. Well, I think the old growth model is pretty good, and that's the one the United States used to talk about open markets, about engagement, about trade. And we're not doing that in this administration, under this administration. We are not reminding folks, taking every opportunity we can to remind folks about the growth model for the last 70 years that created the wealth in the world, that created opportunity in the world, that many countries benefited from, including China. And I think, again, we don't need to sometimes create new plays in our playbook, but we got a pretty good playbook already, and we need to enhance what we're doing.
Okay,
so
great. We have about 10 minutes or less, really. So please state your name and affiliation, and also just raise a question, not give comments. Okay, because of time concern. Yeah, Nick Lardy.
Nick Lardy, Peterson. Congressman, you've been co-chair of the U.S. China Working Group for many years, and you're interested in educating your colleagues about China. I wonder if you might give us your assessment of where we are. Are we on an upward trajectory where your colleagues have a better and better understanding, or are we on a plateau? And I wonder if you might comment specifically on the question of how many of your colleagues travel to China and get a first-hand understanding of the situation there.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nick. Good to see you. Are we on upward or plateau or downward? Frankly, right now, I think we're in a little bit of a downward swing on Capitol Hill with regards to China. And probably the best example of that is a growing call for reforming the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which is, and those reforms are specifically targeted at Chinese investment in the United States. Now, if you're a governor of a state, you're probably going to be very, very frustrated with an outcome, a possible outcome of changes to CFIUS, because that Chinese investment, in fact, any foreign investment, that's job creation for a governor. Meanwhile, Congress is considering monkeying around with the CFIUS process, and putting a lot of that power now into the hands of the Department of Defense. Now, there are some concerns. There are legitimate concerns about technology and technology transfer and so on. But I think we're taking a heavy-handed approach to it. It's probably a more nuanced approach we can take. But I think that is the example of how I'd back up the statement, kind of in a downward. How many members of Congress go to China in a year? I don't know the number, but I just say last year when I went with the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, we had 6 members go. 4 of them was their first trip, and one of them was their second trip, and it was my 10th. So, you know, folks can go more, I think, they ought to. And then when we do go, we need to not do China's greatest hits. You know, when you turn on the radio, the same song comes up over and over again. Members of Congress they go to Beijing, because they got to meet the government, and they go to Shanghai to see all the empty buildings. You know, we went to Chufu last year. We went to Tianjin and Jinan, as well as Beijing. So I think getting out of the big cities, playing those deep tracks on the album in China gives you a better understanding of the breadth of the country, the size of the country, and also you can see some of the poverty if you get out in the rural areas too, and understand that there's a long way to go for some folks in China.
Yeah, go to it, gentlemen. Maybe we take a few more questions.
Sure.
China today, and you talked a lot. You actually just asked my question, but I just want to push a little further. I mean, is there a sort of a political correctness on Capitol Hill to talk about China? I mean, you cannot say anything good about China, seems to be, otherwise you will be associated with a sort of pro the communist government or whatever. Is that the correct sentiment? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I don't think it's the correct assessment. I don't think it's a political correctness that, it's hip to hate China, that kind of thing. I don't see that. I think, unfortunately, I think some members of Congress really don't like China, and they are more than happy to express it. Now, my view is you don't have to like China, the Chinese government, or China as a country, or whatever, or you don't have to like it or hate it. But in foreign policy and national security, China is a player, the U.S. is a player, and we need to be realistic about that relationship and how we handle it. But I also think that some critics on Capitol Hill, some of my colleagues, they may sandpaper the rough edges off their view if they put a little more time into it. Into thinking about the relationship, but they may not change their views. But I don't think it's I always tell folks, don't underestimate the strength or conviction of members of Congress' views. I tell people at home, like, some people actually say what they think, what they actually believe. It may be wrong, but they're not fooling themselves. They actually believe that. So I don't think it's not political correctness. It's some folks see China as a potential enemy in the near term.
We take a few more questions together then, because we only have a few minutes. Yeah, the young lady. Yeah, the first one. Yeah, you.
Purple. In the purple?
Yeah, the purple. In the purple. Yeah.
Thank you, Judy. Judy Zakreski with China Trade Strategies. Looking from the political perspective, from where you're sitting, I think a lot of your comments resonate with people in this room. I don't think that you're going to get a lot of disagreement. Your comments are not in line with what we're seeing out of the administration, what we're seeing out of the leadership in Congress. I'm curious, from a political perspective, how far down this road are we going to go? How long is it going to take us to come back to where you believe, where many of us believe we should be? And what are the touch points we should be looking for? I mean, midterm elections, maybe the next presidential election, and how hard is it going to be to kind of bring us back to what many of us think is the right path?
Good question. Hold on.
Yeah.
Yes. Go to that gentleman. Yes.
Thanks. I'm Bernard Gordon, University of New Hampshire. I want to go back to where you started with the education issue. I want to turn specifically to your view on the Confucius Institute. You know there's a lot of controversy about it, but university where I studied, Chicago, doesn't do it. GW doesn't
Keep
do
that
it.
microphone right in your mouth.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
At the University of New Hampshire, there's a Confucius Institute. There's a lot of controversy about it. Obviously, there's a question of funding. What is your overall view on the Confucius Institutes? Should we be suspicious? Should we promote them? Should we accept them? Should we, again, be suspicious? That's basically my question.
Thanks. So, Judy, to answer your question, I think that what I try to lay out today is really more about what we ought to be thinking long term, and so I think from politically, you're looking at a 2020 election where some of this debate will take place nationally, and the difficulty will be not boiling it down to the jobs were lost argument that we saw in 2016. I think it'll be easier to have that debate because the jobs the president claimed will come back or won't be back, and hopefully we'll see his comments as being wrong-headed, in my view. Maybe some people with different opinions on that, but so I think it's going to be 2020. The other thing I've tried to, again, lay out a little bit is that we need to think a little more broadly. We need to open the aperture a little bit and thinking about China. So again, I don't think you're going to see a lot of this play out this fall politically, but more when we have more of a national debate in 2020. And then on the Confucius Institutes, again, there's offense and defense. I think that there's increasing evidence that Confucius Institutes aren't what they're cracked up to be.
Decreasing or
increasing? That they aren't just merely cultural touchstones. That they are trying to influence decisions. That they aren't as open-minded as what you ought to find in U.S. academia, and so universities are going to have to make a decision about if they want to keep them. Now, from my perspective, I would say that if you can't have academic freedom on a campus, and you're sponsoring an institution that doesn't allow you to have academic freedom on campus, then you need to get that institution off campus. that'd be but the flip side is, what are we doing? Right? Okay, all right, we're going to kick off Confucius Institutes off of campuses all over the country. What have we done to further understanding of China, Chinese culture, Chinese language? And we ought to be investing in that, expanding programs that universities do have on Chinese language and Chinese culture and China studies, and not rely on outsourcing it to Confucius Institute or anything else for that matter.
Well, with that, probably we have to conclude this session. And I want the audience to join me. Really thank you, Congressman, to, at this critical time, still provide a more optimistic view about the U.S. China relation. In that regard, again, please join me, and thank you, Congressman. Thank you.